Chapter 24. The Void Between Stars. Cato, Raven and Maya moved away from the rest of the team and took position at the edge of the city square to the west. They stood side by side, facing four narrow streets that looked like black holes inside a nebula. It was dark and foggy. Within seconds, the wave that consisted of dozens, perhaps even hundreds of silhouettes, flooded the streets like a river breaking through a dam. It was a chaotic and bloody spectacle. They all ran without any guidance or leadership, fueled only by their inexplicable lust for aura. Everyone wanted to be the first to reach their target. Many stumbled to the ground, entangled in a maelstrom of limbs and trampled by a roaring current of leather boots. Some managed to crawl back into an upright position and continued running, while the rest remained on the frozen cobbles, getting devoured by the uninterrupted stampede.
Raven,
Cato said solemnly when the first silhouettes started to trickle into the city square.
stay a few yards behind us and start gathering your aura. We need to take their attention away from Koba, so don't even think about holding back. Maya and I will take out as many as possible before they can reach you, but there is no guarantee we are able to stop them all. Kill the ones that slip through our defense. If we start to lose ground, and you find yourself getting overwhelmed, stop using your aura and retreat to a safer distance. At that point, we will switch roles and they should target me instead.
Kay.
There is no time to argue, Raven. I know what you want to say, but my mind is already made up. I promise to keep you and your sister safe, and I fully intend to uphold that promise, no matter what.
Raven grabbed Cato by the back of the neck and pulled their foreheads together.
I will not get overwhelmed, damn it! So stop with that nonsense! You don't have to set yourself on fire just to keep us warm!
Incoming, Cap!
Maya shouted and moved forward with her curved swords in hands to engage the first three who rushed into the square.
Stick to the plan, Raven. Whatever happens, happens. We'll deal with the consequences when we survive the day,
Cato said and turned around to lend Maya his support. In only a few seconds, dozens of mindless ghouls filled the empty space at the heart of the city. All of them carried the eyes of madness. Even the way they moved looked disturbingly feral and unhinged. Like moths to a flame, they were magnetized to the bright light that Raven held inside his hands. And like spiders hunting in front of the flame, Cato and Maya caught the ghouls in their web of steel before they were able to come near Raven. One by one, the charging Merylesians collapsed to the ground. Some of them fell dead in an instant, while the remaining few were left flopping and twitching in a shallow puddle of blood. Maya spun her arms like a windmill in a hurricane and let her blades get a taste of whichever part of the enemy they came in contact with. Her movement was no longer graceful and calculated as it was before, but rather wild and opportunistic, darting back and forth between enemies from one side to another. As long as her curved swords were able to land on their target, she considered her strike a success. Her priority was not to kill, but rather to incapacitate as many of the enemy as she could in order to impede the incoming flood. Cato's approach was much more methodical and stationary, having been taught by Principal Aaron to always be considerate with his movements. His technique may look lazy to the untrained eye, but each strike he dealt was deliberate and deadly accurate. Any swing from his sword that didn't result in the loss of a life should be perceived as a failure. His blade swished through the air, creating vortexes in the fog that made him think of Matron Tea's celery soup he used to hate so much. The blood and guts that splattered on him felt similar to dozens of slugs bursting onto his skin during one of his late-night escapades. The demons of his childhood suddenly seemed so trivial in the face of actual demons. But, as easy as they made it look, the seemingly never-ending avalanche of snapping jaws and whipping claws was simply too much for just the two of them to handle. More and more Merylesians were starting to leak through the cracks of their defensive line. Raven was forced to take a few steps back when 6 ghouls managed to bypass the attacks of Cato and Maya. When he felt that he had created sufficient distance, he dug his heels into the cobblestones and anchored down, holding one of his arms stiffly behind his back. It was engulfed in a bright light like a sleeve of undulating white flames that sent off whooshing and rumbling sounds like a blazing furnace. The use of aura elevated his excitement through the roof, but he had learned from his mentor that timing and accuracy were the key ingredients to success. So, he waited for the right opportunity to strike, waited for the 6 Merylesians to line up perfectly. He waited and waited, testing his patience and composure to the limit. He made some minor adjustments with his feet and finally straightened his arm with a powerful push when the ghouls were only a few yards removed from his face. The white flames from his sleeve dispersed into millions of tiny sparks in front of him, forming a cone-shaped helix of brightness that lit up the entire city square for less than a second like the flash of a lightning bolt. The intense heat from his auric technique vaporized all 6 ghouls in an instant, etching the imprints of their shapes on the cobbles as permanent shadows. The first wave of enemies had been vanquished, but there was no time to celebrate their success. Many more mindless monsters already made their way to the heart of the city by the time Raven had finished his technique. The square was littered with the dead and half-dead, but the new influx of ghouls never slowed down upon seeing their motionless comrades on the blood-soaked cobbles. On the contrary, Raven's powerful technique only seemed to invigorate their lust for his aura. Kato and Maya were forced to pick up the pace, but despite their best effort, started to get completely overrun by the ever-growing whirlwind of claws and fangs. It was hopeless, like stopping a flood with a barrier of cloth. The number of ghouls had become so great, the entire city square turned into a mass gathering of dark silhouettes.
Raven! Retreat!
Kato shouted at the top of his lungs while dodging and slashing every movement he caught in his sight. His voice was completely drowned out by the sound of a stampede crossing a shallow lake of blood.
Raven!
He shouted again, but made the mistake of turning his head to find his pupil. A rapidly growing wall of shadows was the last thing he saw before he was rammed to the ground by a firm knock to his back. He immediately tried to claw back to his feet, but was pinned face down to the cold cobbles. A never-ending tidal wave of pain crashed down on him as he was getting crushed under the weight of heavy boots. He screamed out in agony when his fingers snapped like brittle twigs in a hailstorm. The pain brought back memories of a time in his childhood when Cronus Metalung broke close to every bone in his body. He tried to force himself upright, but each time he even raised his head to sneak in a breath, the air got stomped right out of his lungs. Everything was fading to black. He tried to shout at Raven one last time when he saw his beloved pupil getting swarmed by the feral horde, but his lips were only blowing bubbles in a puddle of blood. Suddenly he was getting lifted by his shoulders and cradled in the arms of Maya. There wasn't a single part of his body that didn't hurt, but all pain seemed erased and forgotten when he stared into the eyes that made the stars seem dull. His head was throbbing and his vision was blurred, but he saw her eyes so vividly clear. His mind travelled to a time in his childhood when he woke up from a coma, and the first thing he saw was the face of Nia Seraphine.
Goddess,
he whispered under his breath. Blood leaked from the corners of his mouth as he moved his lips. He didn't think Maya would be able to hear what he said, but that lone word seemed to have completely removed her from her composure. She forced herself to shake it off as there were more pressing matters at hand. All around them, the torrent of ghouls kept flooding into the city square.
Come on, let's get you to safety,
she said, and began to focus her aura to create a portal.
no,
He said weakly, and wrapped his mangled hands around her wrist.
please, do not endanger yourself on my behalf.
He turned his head to Raven, who was at the center of a swirling vortex.
It is my responsibility to keep everyone safe,
he said, and labored himself to his knees.
Cap, what are you talking about? You are in no condition to help anyone at all. You can barely stand on your own.
He wiped the blood from his face and stared at his twisted fingers, forcing them to move with a grimace.
Do you trust me, Lady Maya?
He asked and raised his eyes to meet her. The question felt more important than anything he had ever asked before.
More than you can imagine.
She answered resolutely.
Don't ever ask me that again.
Even at a time like this, her answer brought a smile to his face.
Then please have faith that I will get you through the night unharmed. I will bring all of you to safety, no matter what.
He once again cast a glance at Raven, who shone brightly like a pyre in the eye of a hurricane. But as powerful as his pupil was, he knew that Raven wouldn't be able to keep up the extensive usage of his aura for much longer.
I will need your help for this to work,
he said, turning his eyes back to Maya.
Anything, Cap. Just tell me what you need me to do and I'll get it done.
Run over to the others and tell Rain to clear the fog. I want her to form Tortoise on my command. She'll understand what that means.
That wasn't exactly what Maya had in mind,
And what will you do?
she asked.
Raven said something about not setting yourself on fire just to keep us warm.
Yeah. He does have a knack for drama, doesn't he? It's fine. I'll be fine. He is just overly concerned about many things in life. Please stay with the rest until the fight is over.
He paused to think for a second.
Make sure that Rain gets her job done. She tends to lose confidence when things get tough. Tell her not to worry about us, and that I will keep her brother safe. In the absence of Raven and myself, you will be in charge.
Me? Cap, I've never led a team before.
You are a product of Ethel Womb, and you have been trained to lead. You are a Bloodthorn and a Seraphine. People will always look up to you. And from what I've seen so far, Lady Maya, you have given me every reason to believe in you.
Maya stared at Cato with apprehension in her eyes. Though flattered by the compliment, she couldn't help noticing the gravity of his tone. She may not understand the full extent of his plan, but knew that whatever he intended to do was going to be dangerous.
Promise me you'll be safe, Cap.
Before he was given the opportunity to respond, she leaned in and gave him a kiss on the lips without giving it a second thought. It happened so naturally, almost as if they had been doing this ritual for years. She broke off with a fleeting smirk, turned around, and ran off to the rest of the team. Cato was stunned by the sudden intimacy he received. He touched his lips with a stupefied grin as he watched her leave, barely able to contain his happiness. But when he returned his attention to Raven, his smile flatlined. He picked up his sword from the ground and grasped it with both hands just to get a decent grip on the hilt.
Raven!
He yelled as he started stumbling toward the frenzied vortex. He was met with a bright light that was surrounded by what had to be close to 100 ghouls. Each and every one of them were clad in the colours of the Merylesian Royal Guard.
In light, we see death.
He muttered to himself when he reached the outer ring of enemies that encircled his pupil. They didn't even notice his presence and were frantically charging into each other, desperate to get a taste of the bright light at the centre. He raised his sword above his head with great difficulty and shouted for his pupil once more. When his call wasn't answered, he began hacking into the crowd indiscriminately. He kept on chopping until he finally caught a glimpse of a lone figure, engulfed in white flames.
Raven!
Kay, what are you doing? Get the hell out of here!
Raven yelled back while struggling to uphold his auric barrier that kept the ghouls at bay.
Stop using your aura and follow me!
Cato swung his sword around to clear a path for Raven. Blood sprayed across the air like the ocean waves that crashed against the cliffs of Serenity Hills. His fingers felt numb, but he kept pressing his hands tightly around the hilt of his sword as if the fate of the entire world depended on it. Nothing would stop him from bringing his pupil to safety. Raven saw a slight opening being created by Cato and gathered all his aura until his entire body became as bright as the sun. The white flames swirled into a small orb he held inside his hand. He threw it high into the air above him and slammed his palms together with a thunderous clap. The auric sphere exploded and sent out a shockwave that knocked everyone around him to the ground. He quickly fled the circle, dragging his mentor over the cobbles along the way. He ran until he reached the far end of the square. The powerful technique used up most of his aura, but was only strong enough to stop the ghouls momentarily.
Now what?
He asked when the first mindless monsters were already starting to get back up.
They'll still come after me.
Cato removed himself from Raven's clutch and climbed to his feet with moans and groans. He turned to the other members from his team who were still shrouded in a fortress of fog.
Now, Rain! Tortoise!
He roared until his throat became a box of nails. He didn't hear a response, but within seconds, the droplets in the fog clumped together and flowed toward the center of the square like festive garlands during the celebration of winter solstice. Every aura-seeking monster instantly changed their focus and began chasing the streams like a pack of bloodthirsty dogs in pursuit of a rabbit. The sphere of water that was forming above the marble fountain grew to the size of a mansion as it absorbed every last drop from the incoming streams. Rain didn't waste any time and quickly dropped on her knees, pounding her fists on the cobbles with an angry grunt. The water above her head spread out, forming a dome around them like the shell of a tortoise. She focused on the energy she gathered in her palms and squeezed her hands as tightly as she could. Immediately, the dome of water hardened to a fortress of ice that encapsulated everyone within a 10-yard radius. The few ghouls that got through the wall before the hemisphere sealed shut were immediately taken care of by Cameron's massive two-hander and Peyton's trustworthy falchion. The rest of the ghouls that didn't make it in time began hammering the frozen membrane from the outside. They were slamming their fists, elbows, and faces into the barrier, leaving behind blotches of vivid red on every impact. The icy wall was strong enough to withstand even a meteor strike, but the countless smaller impacts it had to endure was a challenge Rain never experienced before. She was forced to use all her concentration just to keep the dome in a stable shape, and each time a ghoul banged against the wall, she lost a bit of her focus. Before too long, the first signs of a crack started to appear. Maya ordered Peyton and Cameron to spread out and prepare for the inevitable moment the barrier would collapse. She then plunged one of her swords into an invisible portal she created in front of her. The tip of the blade disappeared and immediately reappeared on the other side of the dome, skewering the skull of a ghoul to the icy wall. She repeated the motion a couple of times in order to relieve Rain from the relentless pressure, but the attempt was as futile as sweeping the floor during a sandstorm. Each time she took one out, 2 replacements came in to claim the vacant spot.
Kay, what have you done?
Raven growled through clenched jaws. He could only helplessly stare at the frozen dome in the distance that was getting mauled by a horde of aura-seeking monsters.
I have to help them. I need to do something.
He grumbled to himself and started scraping the bottom of his auric well. Sparks were gathering around his arm, but a firm stomp to the side of his head turned his world to black in an instant.
Please forgive me, my friend,
Cato said while catching Raven in his arms.
I know you would never approve of what I'm about to do, but I really see no other way for all of us to survive the night.
He gently lowered his pupil to the ground and turned his eyes to the frozen shell at the center of the square.
In darkness we find ourselves,
he murmured and held his hands in front of his face. The lines in his palms seemed to be dancing around, and all of a sudden, pitch-black plumes of smoke arose from the tips of his fingers like candles that were getting extinguished. It slowly spread out across his body, until he was completely swallowed by a substance that was many times darker than the void between stars. It was neither gas, liquid, nor solid, and yet seemed to encompass all 3 physical states of matter at the same time. His master called his aura a unique gift that was personally delivered to him by the holy goddess. But to Cato, it had always felt like a curse he had no control over. No one in the entire realm truly understood the capacity of his powers. Not Grandmaster Aemon, not King Aethra, not even the teachers at Ethelwomb, who were supposed to be the most knowledgeable individuals in all of Aden. He was on his own to figure it out, and the only person who did make an attempt at helping him master his aura died trying. Even though the fault wasn't his, he did take the death of Minari Oniyume to heart. People started calling him a monster after the incident, and he never disputed the accusation. He hated his aura and every misfortune it brought along. And yet, it felt so right to be drenched in the black substance that was dripping from his body like viscous strings of molasses. It was a warm and comforting hug that told him he was safe, that everything was going to be just fine. He could only imagine the feeling must be what it would feel like to be hugged by loving parents.
Love?
A voice in his head said and started to chortle.
You deserve no love, Cato of Moonshield.
It wasn't his own voice he heard, but one from a man that used to be him in another lifetime.
You are pure evil.
Cato snickered, though no one could have seen it through the thick cloak of tar that covered him. He held his eyes on his palms, unaware that the ghouls at the centre of the square had taken notice of his presence.
You are one to talk, Piper Loxwold. It was because of you that my aura awakened in the first place,
he mumbled. Each word he spoke blew puffs of black fumes from his lips.
And how would you justify my death?
Another voice asked him what sounded like a laboured whisper. He had an accent that was similar to Rain's.
You have confined me to the darkness in this pitiful state for eternity.
It is no less than you deserve, Leonid. You are a monster.
The voice he called Leonid burst into a laughter that was accompanied by ghastly wheezes.
Monsters beget more monsters. One day, you will pay the price, Lord Cato. Monsters only feed on other monsters, and what the flame doesn't consume, consumes the flame.
You Merylesians sure love your overly dramatic proverbs.
Cato replied dismissively. He finally raised his eyes to the frozen dome in the distance.
I hope they all know when to shut up at least.
The ghouls were on the verge of tearing down the icy barrier that was covered in cracks and blood, but they all stopped attacking the moment they were seduced by a much more appealing target. Their heads were raised to the clear night sky with their jaws spread wide like a bear trap. They were licking the air to whet their appetite with the aroma of Cato's black aura. The taste seemed to drive them to a lust-filled madness beyond the horror they had been showing thus far. One of the ghouls decided he couldn't withstand the temptation anymore and charged for the black figure at the edge of the square. And like breaking a twig amidst a herd, every other mindless monster quickly followed the lead. Cato remained icily motionless in the face of the frenzied stampede. He returned his eyes to the lines in his palms as if he were studying an alien object.
Embrace the unknown,
he whispered, and forced his mangled fingers into tight fists. The black mass around him spread into the air like a cloud of hungry locusts. Somewhere in the depths of his mind he heard the cackling laughter of a woman.
Have you finally mastered your gift, young Keto?
A distinct Kyoguni accent dripped from every single syllable she said. Cato smiled.
A lot has changed since we last spoke, Lady Minari.
Show me.
She said, and continued laughing until it drowned out all other thoughts. Her voice slowly faded to silence as a gust of wind blew past, bringing along a symphony of desiccated leaves scraping across the cobbled streets.
Son of the sunset, born from the womb of darkness, bring forth the shadows.